Hi, I'm Felecia Mulkey, the SWA Associate Athletic Director with Baylor University, and we're here today with Scott Stricklin, the University of Florida. Hi Scott, thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
We're going to talk a little bit about becoming a leader. So I know being in an athletic director position doesn't necessarily make you a leader. You're probably a leader before that. At what point did you know you wanted to be in leadership in college athletics?
You know, it's hard to pinpoint a time. I can remember, you know, as you go through, you get different responsibilities. You work for different people with different leadership styles. And I can remember a time when all of a sudden I looked up and I was around these remarkably talented leaders. I was working for a guy named Mitch Barnhart at Kentucky, and he had put together a staff with a lot of young people, and Rob Mullins, who's now AD at Oregon, was on that staff. Greg Byrne, who's now the AD at Alabama, was on that staff. Lisa Peterson, who's SWA at Oregon. There's just Jason Schloffer, who's still at Kentucky in a senior role. Sandy Bell. There's a lot of people. Greg Byrne left, and he brought Mark Cole in. Mark is now AD at Minnesota, and it was one of those moments where you knew in real time, this is really special that I'm getting to learn from these highly talented individuals in college athletics, and if I just pay attention and ask good questions, I might pick up something. And you know, obviously before that, I was around a lot of people, and you learn from every leader you're around. And since then, I've done the same. But that was a point in time when I found myself surrounded by people that gave me a lot of confidence as far as athletic administration and leading young people.
Mm-hmm. What a small world college athletics is, because I learned from Rob Mullins and Lisa Peterson as well at the University of Oregon.
Right.
And one of the things I've noticed in my career as a collegiate coach and now in administration, I take notes, like you mentioned, and I start looking and seeing what would work for me, what would not work for me. Do you have a list of things that you wouldn't do or you would do?
You know, that's a great question. There's you know, no one's perfect, right? So it's very easy to look at any particular person, whether it's a coach, whether it's an athlete, whether it's an administrator, and pick out their flaws, but also, you know, point out what they do really well. And so I don't know that I have a list, but you know, when you're around people who are exceptional leaders, those people stand out as far as and do things that make you want to follow in their example, more so than staying away from the bad stuff, if that makes any sense. You typically, the leaders you're around who aren't as effective, instead of like taking notes of what they don't do well, you just kind of, you don't pay attention as much. But the ones who are really talented, you do pay attention, you want to emulate, and you want to pick up notes. And you know, when I was a student at Mississippi State, and my freshman year I was volunteering in the athletic department. It's a career beginning that a lot of people have in this business, right? They started volunteering and helping, and one thing led to another. And I was toward the end of that freshman year, and I was talking to a guy who was interning in the department, and it kind of hit me that people have full-time jobs working in athletics. Wow, this is kind of cool, right? And so I asked him, I said, how do you get one of these jobs? And he said, well, it's pretty simple. You have to have a degree, and you have to find somebody who will hire you, which, you know, that sounds almost elementary, but the foundational piece of that is you've got to pay attention and figure out, watch what's going on around you, and don't just look at what's happening, but try to figure out why it's happening. Why are the people above you doing the things they're doing? How does it fit into the bigger picture? And then the other part is develop relationships. And so I say all that as kind of a background that while that is how it helps you get your first job, that's also something as you grow in college athletics or any leadership position, it's still very valuable basic information. Pay attention to what's going on, why is it going on, and develop relationships with the people around you. And when you're coming up, you're paying attention, developing relationships to people you want to emulate. But once you get into a leadership role, you need to develop relationships with the people you're leading, and understand what they need from you as a leader, and how you can better benefit them. And so that's, to me, that's whether you're trying to get your first job or whether you're leading a large department. Building those relationships and then figuring out the why of what's going on are really important.
I agree. Aside from emulating and learning from the people around you, do you have core values that have really impacted how you lead today?
Yeah, you know, number one, you know, the integrity piece is really important. You know, it doesn't matter how successful your teams are or what kind of athletes your school recruits, if you don't have integrity at the center of everything that goes on, it gets found out, in the long run. And so that the integrity piece, having people of character around you, every time you make a decision to bring somebody into your organization, you're impacting the culture of that organization. Mm-hmm. And so you can make a positive impact, or you can make a decision to bring somebody in that serves as a detriment to that culture. But if you're going to, I don't think there's any question that to have a successful culture, you have to have integrity and character. And so to me, that's a critical piece, is if you're going to say that, then the people you hire have to show that and have to be a part of that and have to be down to their core, have to have integrity. You find out really quickly in leadership that it's not about you, that's about the people you lead. I heard Greg Popovich one time, the San Antonio Spurs coach, that he was asked what kind of people they like to bring into their organization. He said, we like to bring people who've gotten over themselves, which I think is just a really great way to say, people who don't make it about them, who have their ego in check. It doesn't mean you don't get people who are ambitious, and you don't have people who are competitive or people who want to strive to do the very best, but they understand at the end of the day, it's not about them. So to me, those, kind of having your ego checked and making sure you have great integrity in everything you do are kind of non-negotiables.
Right. I love what you said about bringing someone in and changing the dynamic of a department, and that's I'm a coach. That was my first job, and that's definitely, you're a coach basically. I mean, you're leading that department, but you're actually coaching a team, a team that's coaching a lot of other teams, and it really is true when you bring somebody in. One person changes the dynamic, and you hope that it changes for the better. So,
right.
Yeah.
There's an old saying that teams take on the personality of their coaches, and I actually think that's backwards. I think coaches attract young people who fit their personality, and so because of that, it's really important what the character of that coach is, because you're about to have a lot of young people that are mirror images of that coach and that coach's personality and that coach's character. And so it's really important that the person recruiting your student athletes embodies what you want them to embody. And so that, to me, that's why you as a leader, someone who's hiring coaches or bringing in senior administrative leaders, you can't just go for the most talented person if they don't also fit your core values, because eventually it's going to show up with who's on your staff or who are on your rosters.
Right. I could go a million different directions. I won't. We don't have time. But I'm thinking about you casting the vision, out for your department. So they are bringing in the student athletes. It really it's a trickle down effect.
No question. And you've got to be authentic. We talk about integrity, but it's really got to be authentic integrity, because if you're not authentic as a leader, then you're not going to attract other authentic people. And so again, it's going to, it's like building your house on sand, right? It's going to wash away over time. And so, it's really critical who you surround yourself with, whether it's coaches or leaders, because they're going to, those people are going to surround themselves with like people.
Right. So it's a constant evolution. We're constantly lifelong learning. Can you think back to when you first became an AD, or even just got into that leadership position? Did you identify some areas for improvement for yourself?
Absolutely. I go back to my time at Kentucky. I remember we did one of these self-evaluation where you do a test, and you pick people on staff to do an evaluation of you too, anonymously, right? Or you don't see what they do, but it's a collection of people, and I can remember getting that back, and a couple things in there really were eye-opening to me, and primarily, and this was before I heard the Popovich quote I used earlier, but it was, people thought that I thought it was about me, right? And whether I wasn't humble enough, or whether I wasn't empathetic enough, or whether I didn't focus on others before I focused on myself. And that's a hard thing to hear about yourself. And so, but it was unbelievably helpful in kind of helping me to see not only I had to change, but if I was ever going to be a successful leader, that's what the organization that I led would need, is they're going to need somebody that pays attention to what those I'm leading are looking for, and not make it about me. And so that was one of those times where it was a great learning opportunity. And a lot of times you learn, the most obviously when you have a setback, and I almost consider that evaluation a setback, but it was really helpful in the long run.
I found early on that skeptics are your best friends if you learn how to listen to them. Do you find that the same?
Yeah, no question.
It's hard though, right?
Well, I think maturity helps.
Right.
As a young person, it's really hard.
Yeah.
I have teenage daughters, and I want to drill into their head today what it took me 30 years to hear.
Right.
And so I do think maturity helps with that. But there's no question that if everybody is telling you how everything's great all the time and what you're doing well all the time, you never get better, right? In athletics, as we all know, you get in the weight room and you tear down muscles to build them back up. And on the practice field, you correct what's not being done well so people can be better. Same thing in leadership. And if you're not being told what your blind spots are, if you don't have people you trust around you to point out how you need to be better, you're fooling yourself and you're not being the kind of leader you can be.
I was thinking as you were talking about that, in your leadership group, do you make sure you don't have yes men there, right? Like you have people who are going to be honest with you and maybe a devil's advocate in the room. Because I think the best decisions are made when you can poke holes in them.
Absolutely.
So is that an important piece when you're putting your leadership group together? Other than trust, right? I mean, the trust and you're casting your vision, but you also have to be honest with you.
Right. I think really good leaders, they want feedback, and they want discussion. I love debate.
Right.
Sometimes when everybody's feels one way, I'll throw an idea out just to, that may be contrarian, just to get conversation, to test what they think. Even if I agree with them, I want to make sure that we're looking at it from all angles. Ego is a scary thing. I think some leaders, they don't want people to disagree with them, and it's probably self-confidence, a lack of self-confidence. Ego get in the way.
I think as a leader, showing humility a lot of times is a great way to build trust in the people that are working with you.
Right, but it's counterintuitive because when you're first in that position, you think it's the opposite.
Right.
You think it shows weakness.
Right.
When you're exactly right, it does show trust. It shows belief that you want their help, and instills confidence in your staff that they are going to be contributors and they're going to be a part of the decision-making process. But I can look back on early when I was athletic director, decisions I made that I would make totally different today. And I would include a different set of people in those decision-making processes than what I did when I first became an AD.
But anything you're still working on that you still feel like is, I know it's lifelong learning, but is there anything still, because you've been very successful, so what would you still work on today?
I always feel follow up to details and checking in on people. We have a big staff. The bigger your staff gets, the harder it is to feel like everything that's going on, and the more you have to rely on your other leaders within the department to do their job. And so, but you still feel that pressure to know every single detail, because ultimately you're the one responsible. So. So trying to be as efficient as possible and trying to make yourself as available as possible is something I still feel pressured to do. Valuing the people who are around you and showing them that you value them is, even though I feel like I do that, if you ask me, do I do that, I'd say, sure, I could do it better, right? And because people never get enough of hearing that they're doing a good job, or being thanked, or having appreciation shown. And so, those are the things that sometimes I walk away from a meeting and I go, I should have taken the time in front of that person's peers to really praise them for what they've done. And then I make a note to do it later, but it's never quite the same, right? So always trying to look for opportunities at the right time to lift others up and thank them. That's a constant challenge.
Right. Well, and you've come into this athletic director position, I think, in two different ways. You were at Mississippi State, where you were a senior associate AD, and stepped into the AD role, and then now at Florida. Was your approach in the beginning different? Because you were familiar with Mississippi State a lot more than Florida. Talk about that, just the different approach for that.
It was very different. Part of it dealt with, because I did have more of an understanding of the department at Mississippi State. Also, partly because I was more inexperienced at that point. I was much different at Florida. At Mississippi State, I tried to, Greg Murn, my predecessor at Mississippi State, my good friend, had created some good momentum. I wanted to continue that momentum, and so I tried to keep us down certain paths, and it took me a while to kind of get my own sea legs and kind of put my stamp on it, so to speak. And again, your ego goes into that, right? Am I just doing what I think he would do, or am I doing what I think is right? And what's the right time to do something different? Instead of just saying, forget that, let's do what's best for Mississippi State, and we'll figure it out. When I got to Florida, I'm following, a legendary guy in Jeremy Foley. Department has, at that point, I think 7 straight years or 8 straight years in the top 5 in the National Directors Cup standings and national championships and right. And I was much less concerned when I got to Florida about people knowing I was the guy in charge than I was when I first became AD at Mississippi State. And so that's probably maturity, right? I just, I didn't want to be the guy that in the first 6 months at Florida blew the thing up and had a unfortunate course correction. I wanted to make sure that I understood the place, because I didn't know it the way I knew Mississippi State. So I wanted to learn about the place. I wanted to learn about the people. I wanted to understand why it had been successful, and to look for opportunities that we could start focusing on to try to better ourselves. I was probably more patient at Florida than I was originally at Mississippi State. It was also a totally different department, right? More sports at Florida. The size of our staff was twice as big at Florida as it was at Mississippi State. So there's a lot more to dive into and try to understand there that probably affected the way I initially went about those 2 jobs.
Right. And you would think that it would be easier at Mississippi State because you're familiar, but that it would almost be, in my opinion, more of a challenge because you were familiar. Florida, brand new, and you get to learn about everything.
Right. So. There's certainly different pros and cons both ways. I guess in some ways at Mississippi State, I knew who everybody was, and I knew who their uncles and aunts were. Right. And in some ways that was bad too, right? They knew me pretty well also, and some things about my upbringing and where I had been. Whereas at Florida, everything's new. I'm new to them, they're new to me. And it's just more of a fresh start in that way. Obviously, both great institutions, both hold a really special place in my heart, and I still very fond of Mississippi State and root for the Bulldogs every chance I get. And at the same time, I'm really appreciative for the way the Gators have embraced me and my family, and I get to work with an exceptional group of coaches and staff there on a daily basis that's really special, and obviously those coaches get to lead some of the brightest young student athletes you'll see anywhere.
Well, I would say you made it successfully through your first 6 months.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you.
It has been great. I've learned a lot. Thank you for being
Absolutely.
on Athletic Director U. Is there anything you want to leave us with? Becoming a leader? Any last minute advice?
I always tell young ADs or people who are moving into the role for the first time, and we touched on this earlier, but ask questions. Whether it's people on your staff or if it's ADs that at other schools, people who are former ADs that you knew along the way. People love helping others, and that they want to help. They want to lend a hand. And a lot of people have made the mistakes before, and if you just ask the question, sometimes you can avoid making the same ones.
Absolutely. Don't suffer that learning curve.
That's right.
This is Felecia Mulkey, SWA and Associate Athletic Director with Baylor University, and we've been talking with Scott Stricklin from the University of Florida about becoming a leader.